The Galactic Council chamber was filled with the sound of satisfied voices as Ambassador Daniel Carter gathered his papers with slow and careful movements. After 15 years of humanity being part of the Council, the vote had finally happened. The numbers showed 847 to 1. The Council had decided that humans were too aggressive, too wild, and too dangerous to stay among the civilized species of the galaxy. High Arbiter Velshan stood at the center podium, her voice clear and cold as ice. She announced that humanity had 6 standard months to remove all their people, all their buildings, and all their ships from Council space. She thanked them for their service but said the decision could not be changed. Daniel looked around the huge chamber at the representatives from 2,000 different species. Not a single one would meet his eyes except for Ambassador Kira Wells from the human colony of New Seattle. She sat frozen in her chair with her jaw tight and her hands gripping the armrests. The Valorians were there, the same species whose trade routes humanity had protected for 10 years, and they just stared at their screens. The Prethik were there too. The ones whose colony humanity had saved during the deadly scourge outbreak 3 years ago. They shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing at all. Daniel spoke one word very quietly, said humanity understood and would follow all the rules. He said they would begin leaving immediately as he walked down the long aisle toward the giant doors. He heard the Morenthi delegate whisper to the person sitting next to her. She said that finally things could return to proper diplomatic behavior. Daniel stopped at the doorway and turned around one last time, told them they might want to update their emergency plans because humans would not be answering calls anymore. The doors closed behind him with a sound like air being sucked out of a room, and it felt very final. On the human flagship called Defiance, Captain Lisa Morgan received the message from Daniel and immediately started giving orders to her crew. Within just a few hours, every single human ship in Council space got the same message. It was simple and clear. Pack everything up, because we are going home. The withdrawal started with quiet efficiency that surprised many observers. Human cargo ships stopped making their regular supply runs to Council stations. Medical ships lifted off from frontier hospitals and set course for human space. Defense platforms went dark and silent, then were taken apart and loaded onto transport vessels. The humans, who had built lives on Council worlds, started booking tickets home. Their faces showed nothing that others could read. When Counselor Genitar of the Axion Collective visited the human medical station that orbited his home planet, he found it already half empty. Dr. Patricia Lewis was watching workers remove expensive equipment and load it into containers. Genidar clicked his mandibles, the way his species did when nervous, and told the doctor there was no need to hurry so much. He said the medical exchange program could continue under new rules and arrangements. Patricia did not look up from the computer pad she was holding. She told him the Council had voted humanity out. They were just doing what was asked. The counselor reminded her that the clinic treated 50,000 patients every year and the nearest Council medical facility was 3 sectors away. Patricia marked another item on her pad and said she knew that already. She suggested he should think about expanding the local hospitals. Then she told him they were taking the gene sequencers because humanity had paid for them with human money. By the end of the first month, everyone could see how big the human departure really was. 1,700 facilities that humans operated across Council space were shutting down. Trading posts went silent. Relay stations stopped answering calls. Agricultural processing plants stood empty. Water purification systems were dismantled. Mining operations closed. Freight hubs that had moved billions of tons of cargo went dark. The Council had expected humans to leave. That was the whole point of the vote. What they had not expected was for humans to take absolutely everything with them. On the agricultural world called Preth 7, the massive grain processing facilities that humanity had built and run for 8 years stood completely empty. The local Pretha government thought they would just hire new workers to run the machines. But Minister Colvin discovered a problem when he walked through the silent complex. The facilities were designed for human bodies. Control panels were built for human hands with 5 fingers. The safety systems only responded to human fingerprints and eye scans. The instruction manuals were written in English with only basic translations into other languages. Minister Colvin said confidently they would adapt everything to work for prefect workers. But 3 weeks later, the facility had not processed a single grain of wheat or corn. The harvest season was coming fast, and 40 billion tons of grain had nowhere to go and no way to be prepared for shipping. In the Valorian trade corridor, Merchant Captain Selvik watched his cargo schedule with growing worry in his heart. Before the human withdrawal, his route from Valoria Prime to the outer markets had taken 12 days of travel time. Human relay stations had handled traffic control, refueling stops, repair services, and security patrols. Now those stations were dark and empty, so ships had to take longer routes to council facilities that were crowded and understaffed and slow. His 12-day route now took 26 days. All his profit disappeared. And he was not the only one facing this problem. Traffic Controller Martian reported to his supervisor at Council Station. 47 with frustration in his voice, he said this. Was the 5th ship just this week requesting emergency help? A Krennic's cargo ship had engine failure and was stuck floating in space between waypoints. His supervisor told him tiredly to send a rescue. Ship Martian said all the rescue ships were already out helping other vessels. The nearest available rescue ship was 11 hours away. The supervisor said then the Krennic's ship would have to wait. Martian explained the ship was carrying live. Biological samples and the machines keeping them alive were failing. The supervisor's scales rippled with frustration. The way his species showed anger. He said that before this situation, they could have just called the human rescue station, and help would arrive in 4 hours maximum. He pulled up a map of space on his screen and said they needed to hire more rescue ships. Martian told him that Council Budget Committee had already denied their request. The committee said humans had been overreacting with too much rescue coverage at Council headquarters on the Central World. Senator Helen Brooks sat in the human embassy offices that were now mostly empty except for a few staff members. Handling the transition, the requests had started coming almost right away. A message came from the Axion medical director asking if humanity could recommend qualified people to replace Dr. Patricia Lewis. A formal inquiry arrived from Preth 7, asking if humanity would consider a consulting contract for agricultural processing. A desperate message came from Valoria explaining that the increase in shipping times was destroying their economy and asking if human relay stations could reopen under neutral management. Helen wrote the same response to every single request. She wrote that humanity was no longer a council member and could not provide services in council space. She wished them well in finding other solutions. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Commander Jake Peterson was managing the return of humanity's deep space patrol fleet. 26 heavy cruisers, 48 destroyers, and hundreds of support ships that had spent years keeping the frontier safe from pirates, raiders, and occasional aggressive species were all coming home. His executive officer asked what the new deployment pattern would be. Jake replied they would maintain a tight defensive ring around human space only. That meant the Sol system, the colony worlds, and the established human trade routes. Everything else was council territory now, and not their problem anymore. The officer said they had been watching increased pirate activity in the Kresh Nebula, where the Renthi colony clusters were located. Jake said he was aware of the situation. The officer pointed out that the Merenthi did not have a significant defensive fleet of their own. Jake pulled up the deployment map and studied the region that human patrols had kept secure for 8 years straight. He said then he suggested the Merenthi should build a fleet or ask the council for help. In the Kresh Nebula, Merenthi colony administrator Shelris was doing exactly that. Her third urgent request to Council Defense Command had just been denied because of limited resources and competing priorities. The pirate raids were getting bolder with each passing week. What had been occasional harassment was becoming organized hunting. Ships were disappearing without trace. Outlying settlements reported attacks and looting. And the human patrol ships that used to respond within hours were gone forever. Shelris asked her security chief why she did not understand the situation. She said the council had thousands of military ships. The security chief explained that most council ships were assigned to protect core systems in the center of council space. He said the humans had maintained dedicated frontier patrols, and said it was necessary for security. The council had called it wasteful military spending. Shellris asked what that meant for them now. The security chief said now they were learning. The difference between what the council thought was necessary and what actually was necessary. By the end of the second month, the problems that had seemed small at first were growing into something much bigger and more serious, and the issues appeared everywhere across council space like cracks, spreading through Glassen. Preth's Evan Minister Colvin stood in the control room of the silent grain processing facility and felt his confidence draining away in his best engineers. Had been working for 5 weeks straight trying to adapt the systems for Prethik operators, and they had replaced the hand controls with ones designed for their different physiology. And they had bypassed the human biometric locks, and they had translated more of the manuals, but the facility still would not run properly, and every time they started the processing sequence, something went wrong in safety. Systems triggered for reasons they did not understand, and quality control measures rejected perfectly good grain, and the automated sorting mechanisms jammed constantly, and the facility had been designed by human engineers who thought like humans, and simply swapping out the controls was not enough, and the whole system was built around human decision-making patterns and human problem-solving approaches. And without that knowledge, the Prethik engineers were trying to fly a ship when they could not read half the instruments. The harvest season arrived, and 40 billion tons of grain sat rotting in storage silos, while the processing facility sat dark and useless, and food prices across 17 star systems began climbing rapidly in the Valorian trade corridor. The economic damage was spreading like a disease, and merchant captain Selvik had finally sold his ship to a salvage company at a terrible loss, and he was retiring early with barely enough savings to support his family, and hundreds of other captains faced the same impossible choice, and the shipping routes that had been profitable for decades were now money-losing nightmares, and ships sat idle in ports because operating 3 months into the human withdrawal, the situation changed from problematic to truly critical, and what had been individual crises began connecting into cascading failures that spread across council space like wildfire. The breakdown of the Preth 7 grain processing created ripple effects that touched 17 star systems that depended on Prethik agricultural exports, and food prices doubled then tripled in some markets, and people who had never worried about their next meal suddenly faced genuine shortages, and the Prethik government finally hired Tertian engineers to rebuild the facilities from scratch, but the engineers said it would take at least 6 months before operations could resume at even half capacity. And by then the harvest was already rotting in vast quantities that represented billions of credits lost forever. Lieutenant Governor Marcus Hill of the human colony Aurora received an unexpected visit from a Prethik trade delegation, and they sat in his office with their posture showing what their species displayed as desperation. The delegation leader, named Vrencha, spoke simply and said they needed help, and explained their people were facing real food shortages, and that human agricultural engineers could have the facilities operational in just a few weeks. Marcus leaned back in his chair and told them humanity was no longer a member of the council, and any operations in their space would require extensive permits and diplomatic agreements and mutual defense treaties, and he said the paperwork alone would take months to process. Vrencha said they could expedite the process and make it happen faster. Marcus asked if they really could, because last he checked there were 47 council regulations that prohibited non-member species from operating critical infrastructure on member worlds, and he pointed out those were regulations the Prethik government had supported during the vote of Vrencha's mandibles clicked in distress and said they could arrange special exemptions for this situation. Marcus pulled up a display showing Aurora's own agricultural output and said they could do that, but there was something important to understand, and he explained that for 15 years, humanity had prioritized council needs over developing their own colonies, and now they were catching up on lost time, and their engineers were building facilities on Aurora, and their cargo ships were running routes to other human colonies, and their focus was internal development. Vrencha asked if humanity would really let billions of people go hungry out of spite. Marcus felt his voice harden and said spite had nothing to do with it, and reminded her that the council voted to expel humanity, and her own delegate had stood up in the chamber and said humans were too violent and too crude and too unpredictable to be worthy partners, and the council wanted them gone, and now they were gone, and what the council did with that choice was their own responsibility. After the delegation left, Marcus stared at the agricultural display for a long time, and he was not proud of the situation, but he had been at the council session, and he had watched 2,000 species agree that humanity was not wanted, and the consequences of that decision were not humanity's responsibility to fixing. The Valorian trade corridor, the situation had gone from bad to truly catastrophic, and shipping times that had doubled were now taking even longer as the overloaded council facilities began breaking down under stress they were never designed to handle, and 3 major Valorian shipping companies declared bankruptcy in the same week, and merchant Captain Selvik, who had sold his ship, was now working a ground job for a fraction of his former income, and thousands of other spacers faced unemployment. Valorian Trade Minister arrived at council headquarters and demanded an emergency audience with the Economic Committee, and when he finally got his meeting, he explained that the relay stations humanity operated had been the backbone of their entire trade network, and they were losing billions of credits every quarter, and their economy was contracting at a rate that would lead to complete collapse. Committee Chair Renthos gestured understanding with his species equivalent of a sympathetic nod, and said the council was working on solutions, and they were building new relay stations. The trade minister asked how long that would take. Renthos said the first new station would be
operational
in approximately 2 standard years. The trade minister felt panic rising and said their economy would collapse long before 2 years, and they needed solutions immediately. Aranthus suggested the Valorian government could build temporary facilities themselves. The minister asked with what expertise, because the humans had designed and built and maintained those stations, and his people had the structures humanity left behind, but without the technical knowledge to run them properly. And he said they had not just lost the stations, but the engineers who understood them, and the operators who ran them, and the technicians who maintained them, and they had lost institutional knowledge. They did not even know they were depending on similar conversations were happening all across the council and the Renthi colonies in the Kresh. Nebula had lost 12% of their shipping to pirate raids in just 3 months, and the Axion Collective was dealing with a medical crisis as human-trained specialists departed, and hospitals struggled to maintain treatment standards, and the Tertian industrial worlds faced equipment failures in systems they had purchased from humans but could not properly maintain without human technical support. Admiral Tyler Grant sat in Earth Command, watching the reports come in with clinical detachment, and his orders were crystal clear, which was to defend human space and nothing else, but he could not help tracking what was happening in the regions his ships used to patrol. His intelligence officer reported that the Kresh Nebula was a complete mess, and 3 separate pirate groups were operating openly now, and they knew there was no response force coming. Tyler said it was a council problem now. Their officers said the Merenthi were getting hammered hard, and some of those colonists were basically refugees at this point. And Tyler pulled up the tactical display and studied it, and his ships could be there in 4 days, and they could scatter those pirates in less than a week and establish a security perimeter that would hold for months, and it would save thousands of lives and prevent enormous suffering. But he highlighted the human defensive perimeter on the map and said this was their job now, and everything outside that boundary was someone else's problem. And he said it was not their space and not their jurisdiction and not their responsibility anymore. His intelligence officer nodded but looked unhappy about the situation, and Tyler was not happy either, but this was not about happiness, and this was about the lay council making a choice and living with the consequences of that choice. At council headquarters, High Arbiter Velshawn convened an emergency session that lasted 8 hours, and the chamber was tense as delegates from affected regions presented their situations, and the reports painted a devastating picture. A comic impact had reached 12 trillion credits and was rising every day, and humanitarian crises were developing in 40 7 systems and security incidents were up 400% in frontier regions, and medical treatment delays were causing preventable deaths in infrastructure. Failures were cascading across multiple sectors. When the reports finally ended, the chamber sat in shocked silence, and nobody seemed to know what to say until Counselor Treschkel stood and spoke carefully. He said perhaps they should consider reaching out to humanity and requesting interim support while the council built replacement capabilities. Counselor Rentis snapped back immediately and said absolutely not, and explained they had voted humanity out for legitimate reasons, and crawling back after just 3 months made them look weak and indecisive. A decisive Treschkel asked if looking weak was worse than looking incapable of managing their own affairs. The argument exploded quickly, and some delegates insisted the council should remain firm in their decision, while others argued for pragmatic solutions, and a few delegates very quietly suggested that perhaps the expulsion had been premature, and maybe even wrong. High Arbiter Velshin watched the chaos and knew she had to make a decision soon, because the council's credibility was at stake, along with billions of lives and the economic stability of dozens of member species. For months after the human withdrawal, the Kresh Nebula situation reached a breaking point that nobody could ignore anymore, and the pirate groups that had been getting bolder each week suddenly formed a loose alliance and stopped just raiding ships and started actually occupying colonies. The garrison on Merenthi Colony 7 sent out a desperate distress call that was cut off halfway through, and then all communications went completely dark, and 60,000 colonists were trapped under hostile control with no way to call for help. The Council Defense Command Center Admiral Sholpar studied the tactical display with growing horror and told his staff they needed to respond. Immediately his deputy asked, with what forces, because the nearest council battle group was 16 days away at maximum speed. Sholpar said to pull ships from somewhere else and reassign them to this emergency. Deputy explained they were already stretched dangerously thin, and the Vril sectors were dealing with their own security crisis, and the core systems could not be left undefended, and they simply did not have the coverage that humans had provided. Sholpar pulled up the force disposition map and stared at it, and before the withdrawal, 3 human patrol groups had covered this entire region, and they had responded to incidents within hours, and they had made it look completely effortless. And now he understood why it had required that level of coverage in it. It needed constant vigilance and quick reaction, forces positioned at strategic points, and a command structure designed for rapid deployment. Council military had none of those things, because they had always focused on defending core worlds and major installations, and the humans had quietly handled everything else. Sholpar ordered his staff to get him the fastest ships they had, even if those ships arrived undermanned and undersupplied, and he said those colonists needed help right now. But even as he gave the orders, he knew it was too little too late, and the pirates would have weeks to dig in and fortify their positions, and the rescue operation would be costly and complicated and might fail completely. Earth Director Nina Foster of the Diplomatic Corps received an urgent communication from the Council that was marked with the highest priority codes and requested immediate transmission to human leadership. Message came from High Arbiter Velshin herself, and it said the Galactic Council requested humanitarian assistance in the Kresh Nebula region, and explained that a civilian population was under hostile occupation, and Council forces were 16 days from response, and they were requesting human intervention to prevent massive loss of life. Nina read the message 3 times very carefully, and then forwarded it up the chain of command with her personal recommendation attached, and she wrote that humanity should decline because this was a test, and if they responded now, they would establish a precedent that humanity served at the Council's convenience, whether they were members or not. Message reached President Elizabeth Warren within 1 hour, and she convened her Security Council immediately, and Admiral Tyler Grant joined via holographic link from his command ship. Tyler reported they could have ships there in 4 days, and 3 cruiser groups with full combat loadout would tear through those pirates like tissue paper. The president asked about the political implications of such action. Secretary of State Alan Ross answered carefully and said, if humanity helped, then the Council would learn they could vote humans out but still use them whenever it was convenient, and humanity would become the galaxy's emergency service with no voice in governance, but if they refused, then 60,000 Renthi civilians might die. Nina added that the situation was not quite that simple, and explained the council had created this crisis by dismantling the security framework humans built, and they were learning a hard lesson about the cost of that decision. And if humanity cushioned the fall, then the council would not learn the lesson. Completely, President Warren stared at the tactical display showing the Renthi colony and thought. About 60,000 lives and families and children and ordinary people caught in a political situation they did not create and had no control over. She said to draft a response and told them humanity would provide humanitarian assistance, but on very specific terms that protected human interest. The reply that went back to the council was brief and clear, and it said humanity would dispatch medical ships and evacuation transports to provide humanitarian relief, but would not engage in combat operations, and council forces would need to address the security situation themselves, and the message said human vessels would require safe passage guarantees and full diplomatic immunity for the duration of the operation, and this was a one-time humanitarian mission and not a resumption of security responsibilities. High Arbiter Velshin read the response and felt her scales tighten with frustration, because it was help but the absolute bare minimum, and the humans would save lives but would not solve the actual problem, and the council's military would still have to mount a costly operation to retake the colony. She ordered her staff to transmit acceptance of all terms immediately. 3 days later, 5 human medical ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kresh Nebula, and Commander Lisa Chen of the medical vessel Sanctuary immediately began coordinating with the colony's remaining leadership, who were hiding in underground bunkers. She transmitted that they were coming in to extract wounded and non-combatants, and explained they were not armed and would not engage hostile forces, and told them to prepare for mass evacuation. The pirates were confused by the arrival of unarmed vessels and did not respond at first, and by the time they decided to interfere, the medical ships had already loaded thousands of colonists and jumped away to safety in 3 more trips over 2 days. Pulled out everyone who wanted to leave, but the colony itself remained under pirate control, and the economic infrastructure was destroyed, and buildings were burning, and the pirates still controlled the entire system. When the council battle group finally arrived 9 days later, Admiral Sholpar led a grinding campaign that lasted a full week to retake the colony, and they won the battle eventually, but at significant cost, and 3 council ships were severely damaged, and hundreds of crew members died, and the colony itself was reduced to smoking ruins. That would take years and billions of credits to rebuild. The victory felt completely hollow to everyone involved. Cross-council space. Other crises continued to unfold at an accelerating pace, and the agricultural situation on Preth 7 had deteriorated into genuine famine, and the Valorian economy was in complete freefall, and medical systems strained under growing castle loads. They could not handle properly, and infrastructure failed at rates that increased every weekend. With each new crisis, the same pattern emerged over and over, and the council scrambled to respond with resources and capabilities that proved insufficient every single time, and the systems humanity had built and maintained revealed themselves to be far more critical than anyone had realized. When they were working smoothly in the council chamber, an emergency session had been running for 6 straight hours, and delegate after delegate rose to describe catastrophes unfolding in their home regions, and the mood had shifted from defensive to desperate. Economic impact had reached 12 trillion credits, and rising and humanitarian crises were developing in 47 systems, and security incidents were up 400% in frontier regions, and medical treatment delays were causing preventable deaths every day in infrastructure. Failures were cascading across multiple sectors in ways that fed back on each other. When the reports finally finished, the chamber sat in stunned silence until Counselor Treshka stood slowly and spoke in a voice that everyone could hear. Said they needed to acknowledge reality and face the truth, and the humans were not just another member species, and they had been infrastructure, and they had been the connective tissue holding together the expanded council, and the council could not simply replace them in months or even years than they needed. Humans-backed Counselor Morentis countered, but with less conviction than before, and said it was impossible because the vote had been final. Treshkel said bluntly that the vote had been wrong, and they had acted on prejudice and fear. And now their citizens were paying the price for that mistake, and their pride was not worth the suffering of billions. The chamber erupted an argument, but this time Treshkull's position had significant support, and the tide was clearly turning. High Arbiter Valshan called for order and said she would open communications with human leadership, and they would explore the possibility of reversing the expulsion. Votez. The session adjourned, she returned to her office and composed a message to President Warren, and it was the hardest thing she had ever written, and each word felt like an admission of failure. The message began with a simple statement that said the Galactic Council requested formal negotiations regarding humanity's return to Council membership. She sent it knowing the reply would define the Council's future, and in her hearts she suspected that humanity's answer would not be what the Council hoped to hear. President Warren read the Council's request 3 times before calling her cabinet together, and the mood in the room mixed vindication with caution, and nobody was celebrating because the situation was too serious for that secretary. Ross said they wanted humanity back, and the question now was what humanity actually wanted. Admiral Tyler said bluntly. They could not be kicked out again the moment they became inconvenient, and if they returned under the old terms, they were setting themselves up for another expulsion. The next time someone got scared of human military power or human directness, Nina Foster pulled up a comprehensive analysis her team had been preparing for weeks and said the Council was fracturing, and 38 member species had formally requested human assistance in just the past week alone, and economic losses were approaching 20 trillion credits in security situations were critical in multiple regions, and the Council was desperate, and that meant humanity had leverage they had never possessed before. President Warren studied the strategic assessment carefully and said humanity did not choose this situation, but they were in it now, and the question was whether they used their leverage to negotiate better terms or walked it's away entirely from galactic politics. Defense Secretary Paul Bennett noted that walking away had costs too, and their own economy had taken hits from reduced galactic trade, and their exploration programs had benefited from Council resources, and there was a moral dimension to consider because humanity had built systems that billions of people depended on, and abandoning them entirely raised ethical questions. Tyler finished the thought and said it was not humanity's responsibility because the Council made the choice, and they could live with the consequences. President Warren asked if that was really true, and if humanity could negotiate terms that protected their interests and prevented future expulsion. Did they not have an obligation to try? And she said not to the Council but to their own citizens who benefited from galactic engagement. The room fell silent for a long moment, and finally Nina spoke and said if they were going to negotiate, they should demand concessions that fundamentally changed the relationship. And she said not just membership, but real power and real protections. The president asked what exactly she was proposing. Nina pulled up a document her team had drafted over many late nights and said they should propose that humanity return not as a regular member, but as a permanent member of the Security Council with veto power over any future expulsions, and they should demand fixed percentages of Council economic output to fund the infrastructure humanity maintained, and they should require military command authority over the sectors they patrolled, and they should insist on constitutional amendments that protected all member species from arbitrary expulsion. Ross whistled softly and said that was not rejoining, but demanding the Council restructure their entire governance model. Nina said yes, exactly, because that was what it would take to ensure this never happened again, and not just to humanity, but to anyone. And she explained the Council's current structure had allowed 2,000 species to vote out one species on a simple majority with no real justification, and that was fundamentally unjust and deeply unstable. And if humanity was going to rebuild what the Council tore down, it needed to be on a foundation that would not crumble the next time someone got frightened. Warren considered the proposal for several minutes, and it was audacious, and the Council had existed for 10,000 years, and asking them to restructure their governance was asking them to admit fundamental flaws in their entire system. But the alternative was letting the status quo continue or withdrawing entirely, and neither option served humanity's long-term interest. She ordered Nina to draft a formal response and said they would negotiate, but their terms needed to be absolutely Clear, and she said humanity was not coming back as supplicants, and if the council wanted human help rebuilding what they broke, it would be on human terms. This time, 2 days later, Ambassador Daniel Carter returned to the council chamber for the first time since the expulsion vote, and the atmosphere was completely different from before, and delegates, who had avoided his eyes now, watched him intently, and the air of smug satisfaction had been replaced by obvious anxiety. High Arbiter Velshan greeted him formally and said the council wished to extend an offer of renewed membership to humanity. Daniel placed a data storage device on the central podium and said humanity had reviewed their offer and was willing to return to the council, but not under the previous terms, and their conditions were detailed in the proposal. As the document appeared on every delegate's display screen, the chamber filled with shocked murmurs, and voices rose in surprise and confusion. Permanent security council seat with veto power and constitutional amendments protecting against arbitrary expulsion and guaranteed funding for infrastructure and military command authority over patrol sectors. Counselor Rentis protested loudly and said this was outrageous, and humanity was demanding power that no other species possessed. Daniel replied calmly that humanity was demanding protection that no other species had needed, and he reminded them they had expelled humanity despite 15 years of loyal service, and they had dismantled systems that billions depended on, and they were now facing the consequences of that decision, and humanity was offering to help fix it, but not by returning to a system that could do the same thing again. On a political women, other delegate accused humanity of exploiting a crisis for political gain. Daniel corrected him and said humanity was responding to the council's request, and they were stating their terms clearly, and the council was free to decline. And humanity was perfectly capable of managing their own affairs without council membership. High Arbiter Velshan raised a hand for silence and said these terms would require approval from 3/4 of the council membership, and that was highly unlikely to achieve. Daniel collected his data device and said then they had nothing further to discuss, and humanity wished the council well in addressing their current challenges, and if they changed their minds, they knew how to reach human leadership. He'd turned to leave, and the chamber erupted with delegates shouting questions and protests and counteroffers, but Daniel kept walking just as he had for months earlier, and the difference was that this time the panic was entirely on the other side. Over the next 2 weeks, the council fractured into arguing camps, and some delegates insisted they could not possibly accept humanity's terms, while others argued they had no choice, and a third group tried to negotiate compromises that Daniel politely but firmly rejected every single time. Meanwhile, the crises continued without pause, and the Preth-7 famine worsened, and the Valorian economy contracted further, and more colonies fell to pirate raids, and medical emergencies went unaddressed, and infrastructure continued failing at accelerating rates. 3 weeks after Daniel presented humanity's terms, a coalition of 53 species submitted a formal petition supporting the proposal, and within days that number grew to over 300, and the holdouts found themselves increasingly isolated as their own citizens demanded action and solutions. Finally, High Arbiter Velshan called for a formal vote, and the chamber was packed beyond capacity as delegates cast their decisions electronically. When the count finished, the results showed 1,523 in favor and 389 against, with 88 abstentions, and it was more than the 3/4 majority needed. The council had accepted humanity's terms. Daniel stood once more at the central podium, but this time the tone was completely different, and he said humanity accepted the council's offer of membership under the negotiated terms, and they would begin redeploying forces and resuming operations immediately. He paused and looked across the assembled delegates from 2,000 different worlds and species and said they needed to be clear about something important, and he said humanity was not doing this because they needed the council, and they were doing this because the council needed them, and because the innocent people suffering from this crisis deserved better. And the council had made a catastrophic mistake 4 months ago, and they had allowed fear and prejudice to override reason and logic. And they were getting a second chance now, and he told them not to waste it. The words hung in the chamber And no one protested because the truth was too obvious to deny within days. Human ships began returning to their patrol routes, and engineers reopened. Relay stations and medical personnel resumed their posts, and agricultural specialists returned. 2-7, and the systems that had gone dark flickered back to life. One by one, but the relationship had fundamentally changed, and humanity was no longer the grateful newcomer eager to prove themselves worthy, and the Council was no longer the unquestioned authority dispensing membership as a privilege. They were partners now bound by mutual need and mutual respect, and the Council had learned the hard way what humanity brought to the relationship, and humanity had learned that their contributions had real value that deserved real protection. Lieutenant Governor Marcus Hill stood on Aurora's observation deck watching human freighters depart for Council space, and beside him, the Prefect Delegate, Vrencha, stood silently. Vrencha said quietly that she had not thought humanity would come back. Marcus bidded they almost did not, but ultimately they decided it was better to be inside the system. They were helping to maintain, and with the power to protect themselves and others from the kind of mistake the Council had made. Vrentia said it had been a mistake, and she had voted for expulsion, and she was wrong, and many of them had been wrong. Marcus nodded slowly and said what mattered now was whether they learned from it, and not just about humans, but about how they treated all member species, and what happened to humanity could happen to anyone, and the reforms they pushed through protected everyone. Now High Arbiter Velshin prepared for her last official act before stepping down, and the expulsion vote had cost her the position as it should have, and her successor would inherit a very different council with stronger protections and more balanced power. Before leaving, she sent a final message to President Warren that said thank you for giving them a second chance, and they would try to be worthy of it. Warren's the reply was brief but pointed, and said do not try but do, and humanity would be watching closely. And across the galaxy, in 1,000 systems, and on 1,000,000 worlds, life began returning to normal, and the ships resumed their routes, and the hospitals treated their patients, and the farms processed their harvests, and the patrol groups kept the peace. Everything looked much as it had before, but everyone involved knew the truth had changed, and the Council had learned what happened when you took critical infrastructure for granted. And they had learned what it cost to let prejudice override reason, and they had learned that some species, once pushed away, had the strength to survive alone, and the leverage to demand better treatment upon return. And most importantly, they had learned that humanity's value was not just in what they did, but in the principles they stood for, which were fair treatment and equal protection, and systems designed for all members and not just the powerful.